Anyone who's been in a bad spot knows how low life can get. Sometimes life can be so brutal and unforgiving that every day is a waking nightmare. This is one of those stories. The story of a group of homeless outcasts who witness a murder, kill the murderer in self-defense, and then are left to dispose of the dead bodies. I rested my back against a rusty chain link fence and lit the cigarette that sat between my lips. A few sparkling embers at the end of it caught my eye and made me realize that it was the only heat source for miles. The only other thing I had to keep warm was a few newspapers on an old, ragged sofa in the junkyard behind me. And besides that, I had my wife beater and jeans, which didn't do a good job since they were filled with holes and tears. With smoke drifting from my nostrils and off into the air, I looked to the full moon hovering in the night sky. Living in the middle of nowhere obviously didn't come with streetlights, so its glow was the only thing that let me see more than 2 inches in front of my face. Even then, the only thing I could see was the roadkill that was flatter than paper against the concrete, and I'm sure them dead rats and possums smelled like rotten garbage in the middle of summer, but by then, I'd been there for so long that the odor didn't even faze me. While I took my final hit, the lights of the nearby city caught my eye. Just then, memories of the days when I wasn't a nobody flashed before my eyes and made me realize that no one was an actual person, and that person was me. I wondered how I got to such a low point that all I had to offer was my breath and the lint in my pockets. The only answer I got was a smoke-filled breeze. I flicked my cigarette butt into the street and walked through the gate of the chain link fence. There was nothing to see but the towers of crushed cars that led me into my home. Shards of metal stuck out from almost every direction, so when it was dark, it was hard to leave or enter without getting sliced up. There was no way I was going to get stabbed, so I took out my lighter and lit it, noticing the rats scurrying away from the light. As soon as I looked up, someone sitting on the trunk of a car raised his middle fingers. It was Leon, who jumped down to the gravel, giving me an evil grin. I stepped by him, told him to F off, and continued on past stacks of metal and crushed vehicles. Eventually, I reached 2 shadowy figures named Sean and Tabitha lying on my raggedy sofa. I asked if either of them had a smoke. Sean shielded the light from his eyes, telling me he only had 5 left. This surprised me, considering we didn't have so much as spare pocket change. The only way we could get more was to either beg in the city or, if we were lucky, find ones that weren't entirely smoked. Sean slipped a cigarette into my palm. I put it between my lips and lit it as quickly as I could, telling him, "Thanks, I owe you one." Just as I blew out a puff of smoke, I turned around to see my younger brother Xavier. I only recognized him in the dark because of his height. For as long as I could remember, he never grew any taller. He was childish, but he was probably the kindest one of our group of unwanted misfits. Xavier stepped toward me, but frowned when he saw the cigarette in my mouth. Even though he never said anything about it, there was no doubt in my mind that he hated seeing me hacking at my lungs like some 60-year-old man instead of a 23-year-old. Sean spun his head over his shoulder asking, "Did you hear that?" I looked toward the entrance to see a car's headlights and Leon already gone. Tabitha ran her hands through her hair, muttering that she hoped they weren't cops. Before we could find out, Sean grabbed her arm and dashed behind a nearby minivan. Xavier ran to the other side of the junkyard, and he had a good reason. No one, and I mean no one, just came in the junkyard like that. And since it was the middle of the night, it didn't seem likely that it was any folks who were interested in buying the property. I quickly jumped behind my sofa and pulled it backward. Before the vehicle fully entered the junkyard, I was convinced they'd find me. With their headlights lighting up the junkyard, the car stopped. At the sound of that roaring car engine, my heart raced. Two men stepped out and walked to the trunk. I tried to see if they were cops or not, but all I saw was a moth fluttering in the headlights. Sean tossed a small pebble in my direction and asked if I could see anything. I simply shook my head. One of the men walked out from the back of the vehicle. As soon as I saw his leather jacket, all the air in my lungs escaped. Thank God, they weren't cops. The man glanced in my direction. I ducked and held my breath again. I thought he saw me for a second, but then I peered over the couch. Neither of them seemed to notice. They were just having a conversation. Unfortunately, the noisy car engine drowned out every word they said. The man in the leather coat pulled out a gun. He cocked it, and then he squeezed the trigger. Again and again. Shots rang off. Blood splattered across the gravel. His victim screamed in pain, his limp body plopping to the ground. And just like that, it was over. I cupped to my mouth, shut my eyes, and ducked. The air became thick, but I didn't dare to breathe anyway. Both my lips trembled. Sweat poured, soaking my clothes. Did he see me? I had to check. When I peeked over the couch, he looked in my direction again. Then he threw the gat in the shadows near me. He hadn't noticed me. I was safe. The killer grabbed the body by its legs, then he dragged it across the gravel, leaving behind a thin trail of red ooze. That wasn't the worst part. The part that made me sick was the corpse's eyes. They stared me down like a vulture, watching the final movements of its prey. I didn't know what to do. There was no way in hell we could have had some dead body rotting away where we lived. Police didn't come around the junkyard, but on the off chance they did, they wouldn't believe any of us. I mean, homeless folks like us didn't get much respect. By that time, something I realized made my heart stop. The murderer was halfway across the junkyard. He was planning to leave the body behind the same minivan that Sean and Tabitha used as a hiding spot. With my hands shaking, I looked around for something I could use as a weapon. Then I remembered the gun that the murderer threw into the shadows. He tugged and pulled at the legs of his victim. I quickly crawled to the area where I heard it land, but when I got there, my shoulder bumped into an empty soda can. The killer spun around, yelling into the night. I didn't dare to move. He stared in my direction. It felt like an eternity before he finally turned around. A long, silent breath escaped my lungs. I moved forward and felt metal brush against my hand. I picked it up. It was heavy. Just heavy enough to possibly be the gun. Then I felt the trigger and I knew for sure. When I turned again, I noticed the murderer was at the corner of the minivan. Before I knew it, I was behind him, gun aimed at his back. He spun around and pulled out a switchblade. I couldn't speak. He shook. I shook. Neither of us knew what to do. I tried telling him to leave, but the words just wouldn't come out of my mouth. He looked scared, just as much as I was. All I wanted was for him to leave. Maybe if I lowered that damn gun, he would. So I did. Big mistake. He tried to dash behind the minivan. Everything slowed down, almost to the point where time froze in place. Beads of sweat dripped off my face. A wad of spit made its way down my throat. I raised the gun and squeezed. The bullet entered and exited his shoulder in the blink of an eye. He stopped in place. A yelp came from his mouth. I squeezed 2 more times. This time, he stumbled back. With one last squeeze, a bullet pierced the back of his skull. Blood and brains sprayed in the air like a geyser. Then he fell to the ground. The pistol slipped from my hands and hit the gravel. I took a deep breath and tried to take in the sight of the 2 corpses. A shadow coming from behind me covered the body. Sean grabbed my shoulder, choking on his own words. My bones stiffened and I fell flat on my back. Nothing but babbles came from my lips. Leon stormed into the middle of the junkyard, asking why I got involved. I thought he was gonna kill, I said, rising to my feet and catching my breath. I thought he was gonna kill Tabitha and Sean. Sean put his hands over his eyes, explaining they moved a while back ago. I ran my hands through my cornrows and then looked around for Xavier. Leon glared at me, pointed toward the dead bodies, and then demanded we get them out of the junkyard. I ignored him, gripping the sides of my head and continuing to look for my younger brother. As Leon watched me pace around the junkyard, I cupped my hands over my mouth and called out for Xavier. Xavier was nowhere to be seen. Tabitha walked toward us and put her hands in the pockets of her hoodie. Her soft voice, matching the whispers of the wind, she suggested that the ruckus scared him off. She was probably right, but I couldn't stop shaking long enough to say what I wanted. Leon looked directly at me, saying, "Enough with this." The sight of the dead bodies shook me to my core, but I knew what had to be done. I grabbed its legs, turned to Sean, and asked him for help. He made his way over. It looked like tears were forming in his eyes. For a second, I thought he was gonna cry, at least until he gripped the body by its ankles. Blood poured from the carcass as we walked toward the car. The entire time, Sean looked like he was about to puke. There was a bit of green on his face. When we walked by Tabitha, tears rolled down her cheeks. It didn't feel right to ask her for help. I mean, she already looked like she was about to faint. Xavier probably wasn't too happy either. I was sure he was watching us somewhere in the dark. Deep in my mind, I knew that situation must have affected him more than the rest of us. Sean placed the body near the back of the car. I dropped the corpse. It hit the gravel with a plop, leaving the head rolling back and forth. Just then, I dropped down and rolled the body onto its stomach. Sean watched me pull out a wallet from the man's back pocket and said, "We can't do that." At this point, I had to remind him just how broke we were. Honestly, we couldn't even afford food. It was either this or starve. I pulled out the driver's license, took a good look at it, and put it back. Then I checked the money fold. It's sad, but there was more money than I'd seen in years, and it couldn't have been more than 50 bucks. Leon stepped out from behind the car and placed the second body next to us. As I slipped the wallet into my back pocket, Leon pounded the side of a car, going on about how the situation was bullshit. Honestly, I wasn't sure how he could be mad. Maybe it was just me, but I felt like I was gonna hurl. I looked to Sean and asked if he was ready. He sighed and then nodded. It was like something straight out of a horror movie, and Sean didn't have a hard time making it clear that he didn't want any part of it. I didn't either, but what could we do? Who would help us even if I never stopped that man? We had no other place to hide. Not only that, but we couldn't have gone to the cops. They would have arrested us in a heartbeat. Nobody cared about a bunch of uneducated, homeless losers like us. I told Sean to go get the keys. After he did what I said, the headlights disappeared and we were left in darkness. I pulled out my lighter and spun its wheel. A small fire blazed a few feet from my face. On the ground, the flame glowed in the pools of blood in the eyes of the corpse. Sean handed me the keys. I popped open the trunk before tugging at one of the bodies. It took the three of us less than 5 minutes to get both bodies in the trunk of that car. However, it left our palms and clothes drenched in blood. After stuffing the lighter back into my pocket, I asked them if they had any ideas on where to dump the bodies. Leon didn't hesitate to say Iron River. Sean brought up the point that it was over 10 miles from where we were, and we'd have to walk all the way back. I didn't like Leon, but he was right. The water would wash off our fingerprints. I entered the driver's seat and placed the key in the ignition. After pushing the brake in random gears, I realized I had no idea what I was doing since I'd never driven a car. Sean pulled me from the car and sat down. He fumbled with the key, and a few seconds later, the engine roared. It looked so easy when he did it. Leon hopped in the passenger side saying, "Let's get this over with. We don't got all night." When I got inside the car, my intestines felt like they were slithering inside my gut. Sean turned the car around and headed out the front gate. Before we left, I looked through the back window and saw Tabitha, who uncrossed her arms and gave us a half wave. I waved back, then I spotted Xavier creeping out of the shadows. He just stood there, watching us leave into the night. Sean left the junkyard and drove toward the city. There was nothing to see on either side of that lonely road except endless farmland on one side and a never-ending forest on the other. Well, I lied. There was the wooden city sign to our right, which read, "Welcome to Devil's Haven." The original name was Violet Haven, but someone changed it with spray paint years ago. I tried taking my mind off the earthquake in my stomach by telling Leon to check the glove compartment. Leon opened it and took out a pack of smokes and a wad of cash. I could see Sean's eyes grow big in the rear view mirror. He asked how much it was. Leon smirked, tucking the cash into his pocket and replying that we didn't have time to count it. I pointed to the pack of smokes in his lap and asked for one. Leon tossed it over his shoulder. My fingers jittered so much that I could barely put the cigarette in my mouth. As soon as I did, I lit it as quickly as possible. Almost instantly, smoke spiraled around the car. Sean held up his hand, asking for the cigarette. I gave it to Sean, who took a few hits and then handed it off to Leon. I waited for Leon to pass the cigarette back, but he never did. He was always selfish, but I wasn't up for arguing with him that night. I lit 2 more, gave one to Sean, and kept one for myself. Not before long, smoke filled the vehicle. At this point, Leon's directions made me wonder if he knew where we were going. We drove deeper into the city until rundown shops and buildings were all we saw. Then suddenly, I spotted a river just past a group of trees. Leon pointed at a dead end at the end of a cul-de-sac. Sean drove off the road and onto a dirt path leading into a thick forest. Leon pointed through all the dust in the air and told Sean to make a left at the boulders up ahead. The closer we got to the river, the tighter the knot in my stomach became. Then I saw the moonlight glistening in Iron River's pitch black waters, and it felt like the knot was so tight it'd never go away. Right about then, Sean started talking about turning back. Leon chimed in that it was too late for cold feet. Even though I wouldn't admit it, I secretly sided with Sean. I didn't want to do it, I just wanted to go home. Sean stopped at a nearby oak tree. I looked at the row of houses on the other side of the river. A light flickering on and off in one of the attic windows caught my attention for a split second. Leon exited the car and walked to the trunk, exclaiming once again that we didn't have all night. With the way he talked, it was like he'd done this hundreds of times. Sean whimpered, slipped out the car, and made his way to Leon. Leon placed his hands on the trunk. I stepped out of the car, wiped away the sweat on my forehead, and treaded toward them. It felt like the entire world was watching us. Leon pushed the car forward and said to do as he did. All 3 of us pushed that car together. Sean began more of his whimpering, which sounded muffled for him being so close to me. Then, I noticed his mouth wasn't moving. I glanced at Leon. His mouth wasn't moving either. Where was the noise coming from? It didn't click in my head until I saw the evil grin on Leon's face. Oh, and by the way, one of those guys was still breathing, he said. I froze and stopped pushing the car. Leon's smirk grew as he told me he didn't care enough to tell me. Sean looked like he was about to have a mental breakdown. Screams for help came from inside the trunk. The man's suffering made me want to crawl in a ditch and die. I turned to Leon for an explanation. All he did was shrug and say, "If I told you this before, what would you have done? Call the cops? Take him to the hospital? Ain't nothing we coulda or woulda done. He was as good as dead then, and he's as good as dead now." Leon pressed his hands on the trunk before asking me, "So, what are you gonna do, kid? Are you gonna let this poor guy suffer, or are you gonna do a good deed and end his misery?" The grin on Leon's face kept growing. By now, he looked psychotic. I stood there for a few seconds and thought about what I could do. It was horrible, and there was no way I would have ever admitted it, but I knew he was right. Again. The only thing I could do was to slowly place my hands on the car and hold my breath. Leon turned to Sean and asked if he was coming. Sean didn't say anything. He dropped to his knees and buried his face in the ground. As Leon shook his head, I pushed the car toward the river. The dying man's blood-filled wheezes filled my ears. I tried to block them out by focusing on the sound of the river water. It didn't work. The wheezes just seemed to grow louder. On the other hand, Leon didn't seem to be bothered. Like, at all. The car reached the riverbank. Water filled my sneakers, freezing my feet. More bloody wheezes came from the trunk. Leon shouted at me to ignore it. We pushed until we were waist deep in the water. By then, we didn't need to do anything else. The river swallowed up the car in a matter of seconds. Soon, there was nothing to be seen but its roof. That hunk of metal was gone, and so was the man inside. I dragged myself out of the water and took a deep breath. The man's bloody wheezes replayed over and over again in my head. I clenched my stomach. With all the rumbling, it was like someone had replaced my stomach with a washing machine. Leon pulled himself from the river, looked me square in the eyes and said, "Alright, are you ready, you nutcase? I'd tell you lost it, but you can't lose something you never had." And that is the end of this reading. I hope you enjoyed this portion of the novel The Junkyard Kids. If you did, the full book is available on Amazon. The purchase does support myself and this channel. A link to the Amazon page is in the description. One thing I do want to point out is that a few minor things were changed to make it easier to follow along while listening to. A lot of character dialogue was removed. Multiple characters talking at once seemed to make things more confusing than necessary. Also, there are a few different storylines in the actual book. This one covered the main storyline. Anyway, liking this video does help it in the algorithm so more people can see it. Furthermore, every detailed Amazon review has a chance to be featured in one of my videos. All it takes is a sentence or two. And if you would like to see more content, consider subscribing. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.